Slave scheduling. So we've completely overhauled the slave scheduling system. It's now completely separate from power management. So Pulse previously needed to be running for the scheduled slave system to be running together with, say, thermal management, which, although that is individually redundant in itself, the other power management modules, such as machine restart on a regular basis and wake up on LAN kind of activities, were requiring Pulse to run. This has now been completely overhauled, and it's now separate to Pulse. This obviously allows you to start and stop slaves based on the time of day, but the essential new thing that we want to show is that the machine can also be started depending on whether the machine is idle or indeed both. So what is idle? So idle is when we consider a machine is idle due to a lack of input, peripheral input device, a lack of it. So that would be keyboard, mouse, or Wacom tablet. So we effectively know if a user is behind the machine. And if they aren't for a certain period of, say, time, then we can start up slave. But we can add other criteria to that as well, such as CPU, RAM, and perhaps if there's a running process. And before slave scheduling actually starts up a slave, it will actually display a warning message telling you that slave is about to start up, and that's great from a user perspective because they can then choose to delay when a slave starts. And so let's just have a quick look at how that works. So previously it would have been in power management, and it's now been separated out, standalone, not requiring Pulse, so it's here, configure slave scheduling. You can see here how I've set a render farm and a workstation. You can create as many machine groups as you want and put what machines in those groups and whether or not it's enabled that group. And you can see here the traditional start and stop times for a slave, and indeed we've got this option to ensure the slave is always running between the start and stop time as well. Of those scheduled hours is traditional slave scheduling, and the new sections down here is where it gets interesting. So we can choose whether a machine is idle for a certain period of time. We can stop that machine also when it's no longer idle. So users come back, they started typing on the keyboard, clicking on the mouse. We can identify that and turn off the slave. But we might want slave just to finish its current task when stopping. We might also perhaps only want really slave to start up if perhaps it's got at least 4 gig of memory free. There's no point starting up slave if all the RAM's being used on the machine actively. It's just going to end up with the machine destabilizing, and perhaps only start if these slave processes are not running. So perhaps don't start up slave if 3ds max.exe or myexe or something like that is running, and we can choose these options here as part of the slave scheduling. However, this is really only one half of really the idle slave control, and that was the scheduling side. And what I wanted to show you now is the local slave controls. So we can actually view the state of the slave on your machine and control that slave. We can use that same idle detection which I just shown and how it works on the scheduling to start up and stop slaves at certain times, but we can use those options to actually enable a slave based on idle detection. We've also got some additional functionality in terms of setting the job dequeuing mode, and by that I mean traditionally all slaves will try to render all jobs, bearing in mind pool, group, limit, and all the other variables that we use to schedule and control jobs. But here we can actually add the dequeuing mode, so jobs perhaps would only be rendered on a slave if they've been submitted from your machine, or perhaps only been submitted by one user or more, a group of users. So let's just see how that now works. There's a couple of places to access that control. We can access it on my local machine here via local slave controls, and if I've got Deadline Launcher running, I'll just start that up in the background. Don't need to have Launcher running necessarily to have Monitor running, but it's good for communication. You can see here I've got local slave controls. These local slave controls here, I'll just expand it a bit so everyone can see what's going on here. We've got the job list here as well, so if you've got multiple slaves running on just your machine, you can filter those, so you can really drill down to the exact machine we're talking about here. We can then override these idle detection settings. So these are the same settings which I showed for the slave scheduling for idle detection, but this is just idle detection at any time, not necessarily during a slave's scheduled start or stop time. You can see here how I've decided that the settings on whether a slave should start up on my machine are actually drilled down to 5 minutes, and don't do it if my batch or my render or indeed 3ds Max is running. And when I do stop slave, make sure you finish the slave, that the current task gets actually it's rendering before you stop. And in the job dequeuing mode down here, we can choose to actually only perhaps this slave will only process jobs from that have been submitted by this slave machine, or perhaps a group of users here, and I'm only going to render jobs because these are my friends, which is a bit biased, in the queue. Now, with that level of control can sometimes perhaps come a little bit of abuse. So for administrators, and we can shift and click perhaps multiple slaves here. If I notice I'm logged in as super user in the bottom right, we can modify the slave properties, and you can see here that both for idle detection, we can override these settings here, identical to what I just showed, and also the same again, identical to what I just showed, the job dequeuing mode. So as an administrator, you can control these settings on a per slave basis. I'm just showing here how you can shift, select, batch, change properties on multiple slaves at a time, but of course we could do that to an individual. And then using our manage user group permissions system, you can then actually control whether users can actually access this local slave control here in their launcher, and what actual settings they're allowed to play with. So you can still have a certain level of control as an administrator, and also globally configure the farm as well.